Well, greetings everyone. My name's Lachlan Webb, and this presentation is a guide for all classroom teachers on the teaching of gifted and talented students in the mainstream classroom. A question which underpins this particular presentation is, what do I need to know and what do I need to consider to accommodate gifted and talented students in my mixed ability class structure? Firstly, it seems to be a fairly common misconception within society, but more importantly the teaching profession, that gifted students are a rarity. Well, they may not be as rare as some of you may think, with research estimating that at least 10% of the population is gifted. Now, if we are adhering to the law of averages, this statistic means that in a class of 30 students, you could have at least 3 gifted students in your class. The second point that I'd like to make is that approximately 50% of all gifted students do not achieve to their potential, which is half of the entire gifted population, but we'll discuss this subject in more depth shortly. The last statistic I'm going to throw at you here is the surprising one that 14% of all intellectually gifted children may also have a learning disability. But as we progress through this presentation, I'll offer you an explanation of how something like this can actually transpire. So in this presentation, I'll be discussing why it's important that we nurture our gifted and talented students in Australia. I'll be showing you some important statements by the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, more commonly referred to as ACARA. I'll be talking about some valuable research into gifted and talented students. I will discuss ways which will help identify a gifted student, keeping in mind that many gifted students remain unidentified. I'll be discussing various profiles of gifted and talented students, and then be explaining how and why many gifted children underachieve, before discussing how we as teachers can help our gifted underachievers. This is before finishing with just a few examples of individuals who were underachievers at school but became hugely successful later in life. So why is it important to nurture our gifted and talented children in Australia? Well, the world is rapidly changing, as you can see by this chart, that shows us each country's estimated percentage of contribution to global growth in real GDP, or real gross domestic product, for the 2017 to 2019 period. From this, you can see that China and the US alone account for over half of all economic growth in the aforementioned period. Importantly, if you take a look towards the bottom right of screen, you will see that Australia is sitting at a respectable and competitive 1.8%. Now, I suspect some or even most of you are thinking, why on earth are you telling me this? Well, the answer to that is because there is plenty of research to suggest human capital drives the global economy. Other examples demonstrating this point are a nation's gross domestic product is directly influenced by the aggregate accomplishments of its residents with high ability in the STEM subjects of science, technology, engineering, and maths. And gifted children are national and global resources who have the potential to enrich us in multifaceted ways. Consequently, it is in our own self-interest to foster their talents so that they may enhance the cultural, material, and economic well-being of civilization. So folks, students who are gifted or have high abilities are likely to be able to help increase our national economic growth. Therefore, in order for Australia to remain economically respectable and economically competitive, it is important we give ourselves every chance by doing what we can to cultivate our gifted and talented youth. Here I have listed some statements from ACARA. First point, gifted and talented students are entitled to rigorous, relevant and engaging learning opportunities drawn from the Australian curriculum and aligned with their individual learning needs, strengths, interests and goals. I think the key word here is individual. As we work our way through this presentation, you will see that no two gifted students are exactly the same. They will display different signs and different levels of giftedness in various arenas within their own unique context. They vary in their abilities and aptitudes. They vary in their level of giftedness, and they vary in achievement levels, all of which I had just touched on. They are not always visible and easy to identify, which is at variance with a commonly held belief within society that gifted students will succeed regardless, because they're gifted. Well, this statement is purely incorrect. While they may have an extraordinary innate potential and ability, their high aptitude for learning can all too easily go to waste if it is not fostered properly. They can exhibit an unlimited range of personal characteristics and come from many diverse backgrounds. So, in summary, as evidenced by these statements, it is clear that ACARA emphasises the importance of recognising and developing all gifted students as individuals. At this point of the presentation, I feel that it's relevant to talk a little bit about François Garnier. Professor François Garnier is a French-Canadian from Montreal, Quebec, in Canada. In 1966, he obtained his PhD in educational psychology from the University of Montreal. Dr. Garnier has spent most of his professional career in the Department of Psychology at the University of Quebec and has developed one of the most frequently used and respected models explaining talent identification, which defines giftedness as being the possession of natural abilities, that's physical or intellectual, or aptitudes at levels significantly beyond what might be expected for one's age in any domain of human ability. Garnier defines talent as achievement or performance at a level significantly beyond what might be expected at a given age. And he also equates giftedness with high ability, you could liken this to potential, and talent with high achievement, which could be likened to performance. Now let's take a look at Garnier's differentiated model of giftedness and talent, or what is sometimes referred to in its abbreviated form as DMGT. Essentially, Garnier developed this model to explain why some people with great potential achieve and others do not. And at least in Australia, Garnier's model provides the most generally accepted definition of both giftedness and talent. If we look now a little closer at this diagram, we can see that the basic trio of components within the DMGT are giftedness, which is represented by the letter G, talent, represented by the letter T, and the talent development process, represented by the letter D. Two additional components complete the structure of this particular theory, which are intrapersonal catalysts, represented by the letter I, and environmental catalysts, with a letter E. Hopefully you can all see how important catalysts are in developing a person's gifts into high performance. You can see that there are various catalysts in this model that can either help or hinder this development of talent, and is another way of demonstrating that one may be gifted and have veritable potential, but it must then go through a transformative process in order for it to be converted into talent. Another individual that I wanted to make mention of is quite a remarkable man by the name of John Geekie. Amongst achieving eminence in various walks of life, an interesting and relevant achievement came from him conducting neuroscientific research into high intelligence and creativity at the University of Oxford's Centre for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging of the Brain, Department of Clinical Neurology at John Radcliffe Hospital, which is located in Oxford in the United Kingdom. Interestingly, he actually studied the structural MRIs of a large sample of above-average Russian brains. He used this sample because IQ testing was a mandatory requirement for all citizens of Russia under the former communist regime. What did he discover about the neurology of gifted brains? Well, from his studies, Geekie was able to determine that people who are gifted actually have a greater interconnectivity between different parts of their brains, and that they had what is described as high-level frontal cortical areas of the brain. Accordingly, this means that gifted individuals possess a superior creative intelligence. They can process information rapidly. They have what's known as veritable cognitive control, which is the mind's ability to modify and adapt behavior based upon considered thought. And they also have a greater working memory. This type of memory is a system for temporarily storing and managing information required to complete tasks such as learning, reasoning, and comprehension. Okay, now we have the topic of identification. So, what are some examples or characteristics often displayed by gifted children? Remember, these are far from being foolproof, because one of the most important things to remember is that every child is and must be treated as an individual. These examples are a guide only. In saying that, if we begin with the gifted characteristics box to the left of screen, we see perfectionist. This attribute in some individuals can even be crippling. Heightened sensitivity, but I'd also like to add intensity here. So an example of a heightened sensitivity might mean that you more readily display a sense of injustice and fairness, or show more of a capacity for empathy with others. While heightened intensity could mean that one feels a wide spectrum of emotions in a more profound way than most people do. Other gifted characteristics could include being a good problem solver, an abstract thinker, observant, inquisitive, an excellent reasoning ability, the ability to learn quickly, intense interests, they often overreact, and they are often critical of themselves and of others. To the top right of screen, there is an interesting comparative diagram which compares the characteristics of a bright child versus a gifted child. And down the bottom of screen, there is a few other typical social and emotional characteristics displayed by gifted students. Here we have some profiles of the gifted and talented student. It was after several years of observations, interviews, and reviews of literature that George Betts and Maureen Neihardt developed these 6 different profiles, or types of gifted individuals. As you can see, they are successful, challenging, at risk, autonomous, multi-exceptional, and underground. It includes their feelings, attitudes, behaviours, needs, adults and peers' perceptions, identification, and home and school support. It is here where we shift our focus to what are described as gifted underachievers. And gifted underachievers are those students who have a large difference between their potential and their performance. That is, using Garnier's theory, who we've recently spoken about, their gifts are not effectively developed into talents. Gifted underachievers exist in all communities, but many come from low socioeconomic communities, culturally diverse populations, and interestingly, some are individuals with learning difficulties. I think that this last part is a really important point, and why I mentioned it at the beginning of this presentation. And that is, according to US research, 14% of children who are identified as being intellectually gifted may also have a learning disability. And this is compared to approximately only 4% of the general population. Thus far, no one has been able to adequately explain this discrepancy. This statistic also helps to rebut the myth that I spoke of earlier, which is that gifted students will succeed regardless, because they're gifted. The final point on this slide is another one of the statistics that I began this presentation with, and that is that approximately half of all identified gifted students do not achieve to their potential. This then constitutes them being labelled as a gifted underachiever. I really hope that this slide alone projects the message that as teachers we have a huge responsibility to firstly be aware of these things, and secondly, try to rectify some of these damning statistics. So here are some examples of ways we may be able to identify a gifted underachiever. Again, All students will have their own individual characteristics and forms of giftedness which have been shaped by their own individual context. Notwithstanding that, these are some of the more common characteristics. For example, this first one: low self-esteem, low self-concept, low self-efficacy. This is a very common attribute of gifted underachiever, and we know that children with a low self-esteem often find it difficult to concentrate and sustain their interest for long periods. So if they are not achieving at something, they are more likely to give up on problems opposed to facing them and persevering until they achieve a favourable outcome. Others include a negative attitude to school and learning, reluctance to take risks, a discomfort with competition, lack of perseverance, lack of goal-directed behaviour, social isolation, weaknesses in skills areas and organisation, disruptive in class and resists class activity. Now that you are more aware of what a gifted underachiever is and how you may be able to recognise one, here are some strategies you may be able to incorporate into your own teaching philosophy to help remedy an identified underachiever close the gap between their potential and their performance. Help students organise their time and materials. This is so that they can then concentrate on the business of learning. Employ cooperative learning groups. Set specific learning goals, not performance goals, and have students create their own learning goals with a focus on the mastery. Provide students with some choice in terms of what they will learn and how they will demonstrate their understanding of the task. Expect the same level of effort from all students, not the same performance. And with this, don't compromise your expectations because of one's attitude, culture, or socioeconomic background. Praise specific accomplishments. This is simple but very important for all students, not just gifted underachievers. And finally, model motivation. These examples are just a handful of ways a teacher can help set an underachiever on a path to achievement instead of tracking down their current path of underachievement. This path to underachievement is all too easy to take and therefore taken all too often. An example of how easy underachievement can manifest itself is it may begin with boredom. Underachievers often begin underachieving when they feel bored because the curriculum is not challenging enough. This then leads to a lack of study skills. Because of this lack of challenge in early grades, gifted students don't develop study skills. So as they get older and work gets harder, they are unprepared to meet the challenge. This then develops into a low self-esteem. When work gets harder, students initially increase their efforts. If this does not quickly lead to success, students begin to devalue their own efforts and underachieve. Now you probably notice that I've spent a fair bit of time on gifted underachievers, but with half of all gifted students underachieving, I firmly believe that it is incumbent upon me to satisfactorily explain the whole notion of a gifted underachiever. And in order to substantiate the claim that some of society's most influential and successful individuals underachieved at school, I have listed a small portion of this select group here to demonstrate this point. In summary, these are a small group of individuals that underachieved or even dropped out of school. But just think about those who underachieved at school through no real fault of their own, and as a result, never got to reap the rewards from the extraordinary potential that they possessed. And furthermore, in this situation, society also misses out on their untapped and immeasurable contribution. Okay, folks, that's the end of this presentation on the gifted and talented. I hope that you have found it enjoyable and informative, but above all else, I hope you have found it worthwhile and in fact beneficial for your role in your profession as a teacher. If you're interested, you'll see a full list of references used on the following 4 pages. Thank you.